January 1945. A frozen crossroads outside Houffalize, Belgium. Heavy snow blankets the pine trees and blankets the bodies of the dead. A group of German soldiers stands in the middle of the road with their hands raised. They surrendered after a bitter, hour-long firefight in the blinding white storm. American infantrymen move down the line, searching the prisoners for concealed weapons and intelligence maps. One American sergeant stops dead in his tracks. He stares at the feet of a captured German sniper. The German is wearing a pair of distinctive, insulated American paratrooper boots. They are the exact kind worn by the Army medics who were ambushed and killed down the road yesterday. The prisoner smiles at the sergeant, completely unbothered. General George S. Patton will soon arrive at this very crossroads to deliver a chilling, mirrored lesson in the rules of war. This is the story of a cold confrontation at a snowy crossroads where an arrogant sniper discovered that stolen gear carried a heavy price. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the myths of military glory. Sergeant Miller McIntyre was 34 years old. He came from Boston, Massachusetts. He served with the 101st Airborne Division. Before the war, Mac was a construction foreman, a man used to hard work and heavy winters. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed in doing his duty. He had fought through the orchards of Normandy and survived the brutal drops in Holland. His fingers were dark purple, severely frostbitten from weeks of living in the muddy ditches of the Ardennes forest. He had lost his younger brother at frozen Bastogne just 3 weeks prior. The loss left him hollow and dangerously quiet. Now his hands shook with a deep, suppressed rage as he stared down at the snowy ground. He was staring directly at a pair of leather boots. The boots belonged to Unteroffizier Klaus Dietrich. Dietrich was 28 years old, a seasoned Wehrmacht sniper from the city of Dresden. He was a committed believer in the old Prussian military hierarchy, viewing himself as an elite hunter far above the common infantrymen around him. He wore a clean, well-insulated winter camouflage smock, a luxury stripped from a fallen officer. On his collar sat a freshly polished iron cross, a token of his deadly precision. Dietrich believed that the weak existed only to provide for the strong, a philosophy he often voiced to his comrades. He stood arrogantly in the snow, his chin tilted upward, despite the rifles pointed at his chest. He expected the Americans to treat him with the utmost dignity. He knew the rules of the Geneva Convention by heart, and he fully intended to use them as a shield. He felt completely safe. He had no idea his stolen footwear had just sealed his fate. By January 1945, the European theater had devolved into a meat grinder of cold and desperation. The German Ardennes offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was collapsing into a bitter retreat. Supply lines on both sides were completely shattered by the extreme winter weather. The temperature stayed well below zero for weeks at a time, freezing the ground into solid stone. Soldiers were dying from exposure and trench foot just as quickly as they were dying from artillery shrapnel and sniper fire. In this desperate environment, regular military discipline began to erode in the snow. Equipment was scarce, and warmth was a matter of survival. American units advancing through the dense forests frequently found their dead stripped of vital gear. It was a chaotic, lawless environment where the lines between necessary survival and outright atrocity became increasingly blurred. Many frontline officers on both sides chose to look the other way when it came to minor battlefield scavenging. They knew their men were freezing to death in the foxholes, and a dead enemy no longer needed his coat or blankets. Taking items from an active combat medic, however, crossed a sacred line that most veteran soldiers still respected. Medics were supposed to be protected by the shared rules of civilized warfare. But in the frozen wilderness outside Houffalize, those rules were being ignored by men who felt the cold more than they felt their own humanity. The American soldiers pushing into the sector were reaching their breaking point. They had seen too many friends left face down in the snow, stripped of the very tools meant to save lives. The tension at the crossroads was about to spill over into violence. McIntyre stepped forward into the deep snow, his Thompson submachine gun leveled directly at the German sniper's chest. "Take off the boots," the sergeant said. Dietrich did not move, keeping his hands raised, but his back completely straight. "I am a prisoner of war," the sniper answered. McIntyre took another step closer, the cold wind whipping between them. "You took those off a dead medic yesterday down the road," McIntyre said. Dietrich shrugged his shoulders slightly, his face remaining entirely expressionless. "They are spoils of war," the sniper said. The sergeant tightened his white-knuckled grip on the frozen metal of his weapon. "He was a non-combatant," McIntyre said, his voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of grief and rage. Dietrich looked at the other captured soldiers in his line, then looked back at the sergeant with a cold, arrogant smirk. "He did not need them anymore," the sniper said, "and the winter is very cold." McIntyre lowered his gun slightly, fighting the overwhelming urge to pull the trigger right there in the snow. "You know the rules regarding medical personnel," the sergeant said. The sniper tilted his chin up, his polished iron cross catching the dim winter light. "The Geneva Convention protects me now," Dietrich said. "I have surrendered to your unit, and you must provide me with food and shelter." McIntyre stared at the distinctive, insulated paratrooper boots that belonged to his dead friend. "The rules are very clear about the treatment of captured forces," Dietrich added, talking quickly now, his voice full of unearned confidence. "You cannot harm a prisoner who has laid down his arms." An American lieutenant walked up beside McIntyre, looking at the boots and then looking at the arrogant sniper. "What is the problem here, Sergeant?" the lieutenant asked. "This bastard looted Doc Lawson yesterday after the ambush," McIntyre answered without taking his eyes off the prisoner. Dietrich shook his head, looking directly at the officer. "I demand to speak with a superior authority," the sniper said. "Your men are threatening a surrendered soldier, and that is a severe violation of international law." The lieutenant looked at the sniper's pristine winter smock, then at his arrogant stance, and realized the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. "Stand down, McIntyre," the lieutenant ordered quietly. "This is above our heads." The lieutenant turned to a nearby jeep driver. "Get on the radio and call headquarters right now. Tell them we have a situation at the crossroads with a captured sniper and a clear violation of the rules of war." The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the frozen crossroads within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his polished helmet, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters at his belt. The engine cut out, leaving only the sound of the whistling winter wind. Every American soldier in the road immediately stood at attention, their breathing misting heavy in the frigid air. Patton climbed out of the vehicle and walked directly toward the group. His presence was immediate, cold, and entirely controlled. He did not yell. He did not show any outward sign of anger. He simply stopped a few feet from the captured sniper and studied him with a sharp, piercing gaze. "What is the meaning of this delay?" Patton asked. The American lieutenant stepped forward, saluting quickly. "General, this prisoner was captured after the firefight," the lieutenant said. "He is wearing the insulated boots of a medic from the 101st who was murdered yesterday." Patton shifted his gaze down to the distinctive paratrooper footwear, then looked back up into the eyes of the sniper. "Did you take these items from a deceased United States Army medic?" Patton asked. Dietrich maintained his rigid posture, looking directly over the general's shoulder. "I took them from a dead man in the snow," the sniper answered. "Do you deny that he was a marked medical non-combatant?" Patton asked. "The winter does not care about armbands," Dietrich said, "and the Supreme Command permits us to utilize available gear for survival." "So you consider our equipment to be your personal property?" Patton asked. "They are the spoils of war," the sniper answered, "and I am now under the full protection of the Geneva Convention as a surrendered soldier." Patton stood completely still for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out across the frozen crossroads. "You stand here in your fine camouflage smock and your polished metal, expecting the world to honor the rules you discarded yesterday," Patton said. "You speak of survival as if it belongs only to those who carry a rifle in the trees. The man who wore those boots carried no weapon. He walked into the fire with a medical kit to save lives, including the lives of men who wore your uniform. You stripped his body for warmth because you believe your comfort matters more than the laws of civilized warfare. Now you stand before me, invoking a treaty you defiled, expecting an American tent and an American fire. You have a choice. You can admit that you are a common thief who belongs in a ditch, or you can live by the very logic you just gave my men. If our gear is truly the spoils of war, then it belongs to the men who stand on this ground today. Decide right now. Dietrich remained silent, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead, refusing to break his arrogant posture. Patton turned to his military police details standing nearby. "Take the boots off him," Patton ordered coldly. Two large MPs stepped forward into the snow, grabbed the German sniper by his arms, and forced him down onto a wooden crate. Dietrich began to struggle, his face turning bright red as his previous confidence completely evaporated. "You cannot do this," the sniper screamed. "The Geneva Convention forbids the mistreatment of prisoners." The MPs ignored his cries, unlacing the heavy, insulated American paratrooper boots and pulling them roughly from his feet. The freezing Belgian air hit the sniper's bare skin instantly. He gasped as his feet were pressed down into the bloody, ice-crusted snow. The other captured German soldiers watched in absolute silence, their earlier defiance completely gone as they stared at their bare toes turning blue in the winter frost. The American infantrymen stood in a tight circle, watching the poetic justice unfold at the crossroads. Patton looked down at the shivering sniper one last time. "You like our boots so much, you can walk in them," Patton said. He then ordered the guards to march the prisoner to the PBABU camp 10 miles away. Completely barefoot through the freezing mud. "Tell the other prisoners. What happens when you steal from my dead?" Patton added. Sergeant Miller McIntyre went home to Boston, Massachusetts, after the war ended. He returned to his old job as a construction foreman, working on the rising skyline of his home city. He lived a quiet, unassuming life, marrying his childhood sweetheart and raising 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, and he never mentioned the frozen crossroads or the boots to his family. The severe frostbite he suffered in the Ardennes left his hands permanently scarred and sensitive to the New England cold for the rest of his days. He kept a single item from his service in a wooden box in his attic, a pair of pristine medic tags he had recovered after the winter campaign. He died quietly in his sleep in 1988 at the age of 78. Unteroffizier Klaus Dietrich survived the long, barefoot march to the temporary holding area. Though he lost 3 toes to severe frostbite during the ordeal, he spent the remainder of the war in a secluded prisoner of war camp in western England, working in the agricultural fields. He faced an Allied military tribunal in 1946 for violations of the laws of war regarding medical personnel. He served 8 years in a military prison before being released and repatriated. He returned to a ruined Dresden, where he worked as a bookkeeper and lived in relative isolation, remaining bitter about his treatment until his death in 1994. General George S. Patton never recorded the incident at the crossroads in his official daily logs. He did, however, write a brief note about the day in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He remarked that some men only understand the rules of civilization when they are forced to feel the lack of them on their own skin. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision at the frozen crossroads was an unnecessary act of cruelty that bordered on a violation of the basic rights guaranteed to prisoners of war. They contend that stripping a surrendered soldier of his footwear in sub-zero temperatures was a vindictive measure that served no real tactical purpose. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a brilliant and necessary enforcement of the rules of combat. These defenders maintain that by physically mirroring the sniper's crime, Patton sent a vital, unambiguous message that protected the sanctity of medical personnel across the entire theater. What is certain is that the story of the Barefoot March spread rapidly through the front lines, and the looting of American medics in that sector stopped completely. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have sent the sniper to the prison camp with his stolen boots intact? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.